of fairness and independence required that it be removed from the political chain of command within the Department of Justice, because as you'll recall, it seems like a lifetime ago, but that involved the conduct of people who were senior level people in the White House. And my judgment was that even I, as an independent-minded person, was a political appointee, and so I ought to give it to a career person like Pat Fitzgerald.
Well, what about the situation now? We have a Deputy Attorney General. I voted for his confirmation, but shouldn't he be not the one to be investigating campaign contacts when his boss, the Attorney General, was a central figure in that campaign?
That's a judgment he'll have to make. He is, as I hoped I was as Deputy Attorney General, a very independent-minded, career-oriented person, but it'd be premature for me to comment on that.
Past weekend, President Trump again said the hacking of the DNC and other efforts to influence the election could have been China, could have been a lot of different groups. Is that contrary to what the intelligence community has said?
The intelligence community with high confidence concluded it was Russia. In many circumstances, it's hard to do attribution of a hack, but sometimes the intelligence is there. We have high confidence that the North Koreans hacked Sony. We have high confidence that the Russians did the hacking of the DNC and the other organizations.
I have a lot of other questions which I'll submit, but before it sounds totally negative, I want to praise the response to the FBI in South Burlington, Vermont. We had anonymous emails coming in threatening serious action against students in a high school, escalating cyber threats, including detailed death threats, multiple lockdowns and all. The FBI worked closely with the Champlain College's Leahy Center for Digital Investigation, which you visited a couple of years ago. It was a textbook example of collaboration between state, local, and federal authorities. And I want to thank all those. Turned out to be a very disturbed young man who was doing it. But you only have to turn on the TV and see what happens in different parts of the country, how worried we were in Vermont. I just want to thank your FBI agents for their help.
Thank you for that, Senator.
Senator Graham would be next, so we'll go to Senator Cornyn.
Thank you. Good morning, Director
Comey.
I'm disappointed to see that former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was in the news yesterday, essentially blaming you and blaming everything other than herself for her loss on November the 8th. I find it ironic because you're not the one who made the decision to handle classified information on a private email server. You're not the one who decided to have a private meeting with Secretary Clinton's husband in the middle of the Justice Department's ongoing investigation into Secretary Clinton's server. I use the word investigation here because, according to a recent piece in the New York Times, you were forbidden from using the word investigation and were instead told to refer to the investigation, which it was, as a matter. Of course, it was the former Attorney General Loretta Lynch who, up until that meeting with President Clinton, was the person responsible for making the decision whether to convene a grand jury involving the allegations against Secretary Clinton. It was former Attorney General Loretta Lynch who apparently forbade you from using the word investigation. Indeed, if the New York Times story is true, a Democratic operative expressed confidence that the former Attorney General would keep that investigation from going very far. I think you were given an impossible choice to make, and you did the best you could in light of the situation that you were presented with. And it strikes me as somewhat sad for people here and elsewhere to condemn you for notifying Congress shortly before the election that you'd uncovered even more emails related to the investigation, including classified emails, again, because Secretary Clinton had made the decision to use a private email server. And I think it's important to remind folks that you were not the one who decided to do business this way and keep State Department emails on a computer of someone suspected of child pornography. Again, I believe you were placed in an incredibly difficult position. You did the best you could. You may recall I was one of those who felt like, given the nature of the investigation and the concerns, that a special counsel should have been appointed to conduct the investigation, but of course Attorney General Lynch and the Obama administration opposed that effort. So I just wanted to express to you my disappointment at this continued seeking of a reason, any reason other than the flawed campaign and the candidate herself for Secretary Clinton losing the presidential election. If I can turn to a couple of other substantive items here. You've mentioned 702 of FISA and the reauthorization, and I believe you've referred to this as the crown jewels of the FBI and of counterterrorism investigations. Could you explain why this provides such a unique tool and why you regard it as literally the crown jewels of the FBI?
Thank you, Senator. Every time I talk about this publicly, I wince a little bit because I don't want bad people around the world to focus on this too much. But really bad people around the world, because of the genius of American innovation, use our products and infrastructure for their emails, for their communications. And what 702 allows us to do is quickly target terrorists, weapons of mass destruction, proliferators, spies, cyber hackers, non-Americans, who are using our infrastructure to communicate, to target them quickly and collect information on them. And it is vital to all parts of the intelligence community because of its agility, its speed, and its effectiveness. And again, in an open setting, we can't explain what you already know from classified briefings about what a difference this makes. But again, because America is the mother of all this innovation, they use a lot of our equipment, a lot of our networks to communicate with each other. If we were ever required to establish the normal warrant process for these non-Americans who aren't in our country just because the photons they're using to plan attacks cross our country's lands, we'd be tying ourselves in knots for reasons that make no sense at all, and the courts have said are unnecessary under the Fourth Amendment. So this is a tool. We talked a lot last year about the telephony metadata database. I think that's a useful tool. It does not compare in importance to 702. We can't lose 702.
Well, I agree, and it is a little bit difficult to talk about things that do involve classified matters in public, but I think the public needs to know that there are multiple oversight layers, including the FISA court, congressional oversight, internal oversight within the FBI and intelligence community that protects Americans from and under their privacy rights while targeting terrorists and people who are trying to kill us. I want to talk a minute about the electronic communication transactional records, something you and I have discussed before as well. The FBI can use national security letters, I believe, to get financial information and telephone numbers now in the conduct of a terrorist investigation, but because of a typo in the law, the FBI has not been allowed access to Internet metadata in national security cases to the extent that is necessary. Can you talk to us about the importance of that particular fix, the electronic communications transactional records fix, or ECTR fix?
Yeah, thank you so much, Senator. This seems like a boring deal. This makes a big impact on our work, and here's why. In our counterterrorism cases and our counterintelligence cases, we can issue, with all kinds of layers of approval in the FBI, a national security letter to find out the subscriber to a particular telephone number and to find out what numbers that telephone number was in contact with. Not the content of those communications, but just the connection. Again, because of what I believe is a typo in the law, and if I'm wrong, Congress will tell me that they intended this, the companies that provide the same services but on the Internet resist and say, we don't have the statutory authority to serve an NSL, national security letter, to find out the subscriber to a particular email handle or what addresses were in contact with what addresses, although we could do the same with telephone communications. I don't think Congress intended that distinction, but what it does to us is, in our most important investigations, it requires us, if we want to find out the subscriber to a particular email handle, to go and get an order from a federal judge in Washington as part of the FISA court, an incredibly long and difficult process. And I'm worried about that slowing us down, but also worried about it becoming a disincentive for our investigators to do it at all. Because if you're working a case in San Antonio or in Seattle, you're moving very, very quickly, And if I have to go to get subscriber information, for heaven's sakes, on an email address to a federal court in Washington, I'm probably going to try and find some other way around it. If that's what Congress wants, sure, we'll follow the law. I don't think that was ever intended, and so I would hope that Congress will fix what I believe is a typo.
Thank you, Mr. Director. I have other questions for the record. Thank you.
Are going over to vote now, and I'd also like to have both Democrat and Republicans notify me if they want a second round, so I can get a inventory of that. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you. Welcome back, Director Comey. As you are well aware, Russia is actively working to undermine our democracy and hurt American businesses at the same time. Now more than ever, Americans are looking to Congress for leadership, and we must be a united front. And I've appreciated some of the members of this committee on the Republican side who have spoken out about this. We must be united as we seek information from the administration. Last month, during a hearing at the House Intelligence Committee, you confirmed that the FBI is investigating the Russian government's efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election, including any links between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. I know that you cannot discuss that ongoing investigation, but just one question to clarify. Will you commit to ensuring that the relevant congressional committees receive a full and timely briefing on that investigation's findings?
In general, I can, Senator. I need Department of Justice approval to brief on particular people that we're investigating. We've briefed the chairs and the rankings, including of this committee, on who we have cases open on and exactly what we're doing and how we're using various sources of information. I don't know whether the department will approve that for the entire intelligence committees, but I'll lean as far forward as I can.
And then because Attorney General Sessions is recused from that and now Rod Rosenstein is approved, do you go to him then to get that approval?
Yes, I've already briefed him. I think his first day in office, I briefed him on where we are, and so he would be the person to make that decision.
Thank you. In your testimony, you note that the Justice Department brought charges against Russian spies and criminal hackers in connection with the 2014 Yahoo cyber attack in February, an example of a cyber attack in our economy. In December of 2016, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security released a 13-page report providing technical details about how federal investigators linked Russia to the hacks against U.S. political organizations. Does Russia use the same military and civilian tools it used to hack our political organizations in order to do things like hack into U.S. companies, steal identities, and sell the credit card information of Americans on the black market? And how is the FBI working to fight against hackers supported by foreign governments like Russia?
The answer is yes. Both their government organizations and then they have a relationship it's often difficult to define with criminals, and that the Yahoo hack's actually an example of that. You had some of the Russia's greatest criminal hackers and intelligence agency hackers working together. So the answer is yes. And what we're doing is trying to see if we can impose costs on that behavior in a lot of different ways, but including one I mentioned in my opening, which is locking up people. If we can get them outside of Russia, Russia's not too great about cooperating with us when there are criminals inside their borders. But all of them like to travel, and so if they travel, grabbing them and putting handcuffs on them to send a message that that's not a freebie.
In your testimony, you also discuss the threat that transnational organized crime poses to our safety and our security. Russia has vast criminal networks that the Kremlin uses to sow instability across the world. I heard these concerns firsthand when Senator Graham and McCain and I were in the Baltics, Ukraine, and Georgia. There have been recent concerns that organized criminals, including Russians, are using the luxury real estate market to launder money. The Treasury Department has noted a significant rise in the use of shell companies in real estate transactions because foreign buyers use them as a way to hide their identity and find a safe haven for their money in the U.S. In fact, nearly half of all homes in the U.S. worth at least $5 million are purchased using shell companies. Does the anonymity associated with the use of shell companies to buy real estate hurt the FBI's ability to trace the flow of illicit money and fight organized crime? And do you support efforts by the Treasury Department to use its existing authority to require more transparency in these transactions?
Yes and yes.
Okay, very good, because I think this is a huge problem. When you hear that over $5 million homes, half of them purchased by shell companies, that is a major problem. In March, this committee's subcommittee on crime and terrorism held its first hearing. I thank Senator Graham and Senator Whitehouse for that. I raised the issue of protecting our election infrastructure with former Bush Department of Justice official Ken Weinstein, and he agreed that this is a very important issue. As the ranking member of the Rules Committee, I'm particularly concerned about ensuring our elections are safe from foreign interference. I recently led a group of 26 senators in calling for a full account of the Election Assistance Commission's efforts to address Russian cybersecurity threats in the 2016 election. I'm also working on legislation in this area. Can you discuss how the FBI has coordinated with the Election Assistance Commission, Department of Homeland Security, and state and local election officials to help protect the integrity of our election process?
Thank you, Senator. In short, what we've done with DHS is share the tools, tactics, and techniques we see hackers, especially from the 2016 election season, using to attack voter registration databases and try and engage in other hacks. And we've pushed that out to all the states and to the Election Assistance Commission so they can harden their networks. That's one of the most important things we can do, is equip them with the information to make their systems tighter.
Very good, because as you know, we have different equipment all over this country. There's some advantage to that, I think. I think it's good when we have paper ballot backups, of course, but we have to be prepared for this. And this certainly isn't about one political party or one candidate. The last time you came before the committee in December 2015, just 1 week after the San Bernardino attacks. Since then, as was noted by the chair, we've seen other attacks in our country. We had a tragedy in a shopping mall in St. Cloud, Minnesota, 10 wounded at a shopping mall. Thankfully, a brave off-duty cop was there. He was able to stop further damage from being done. And I would also like to thank you and the FBI for your investigation. Having talked to the chief up there, Senator Franken and I were briefed by him, as well as Congressman Emmer, right after this attack. The local police department is a mid-sized department, and they had to do a lot with working with the community. They have a significant Somali community there. That's a big part of their community that they're proud to have there. So they're working with them. They're working with the community. They're helping. But the FBI really stood in and did the investigation. And I guess I want to thank you for that and just end with one question. It's been reported that ISIS has encouraged lone wolf attacks like what we saw in Orlando. It's murkier, the facts in St. Cloud. What challenges do these type of attacks present for law enforcement, and what is the FBI doing to prevent these kinds of tragedies?
Thank you, Senator. The central challenge is not just finding needles in a nationwide haystack, but trying to figure out which pieces of hay might become a needle, and that is which of the troubled young people, or sometimes it's older people, are consuming poisonous propaganda, some ISIS, some Anwar Laki, some other sources, and are moving towards thinking an act of violence like a stabbing at a shopping mall is some way to achieve meaning in their lives. And a huge part of it is building relationships with the communities you mentioned, because those folks do not want anyone committing violence in the name of their faith. And so they have the same incentives we do, and making sure they see us that way and we see them that way is at the heart of our response. Because we're not going to see some troubled kid going sideways and thinking he should stab people anywhere near as easily as the people around that kid are going to see it. And so getting in a position where they feel comfortable telling us or telling local law enforcement is at the heart of our ability to find those needles, evaluate those pieces of hay, and stop this.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Senator Graham.
Thank you. Director Comey, could you pass on to your agents and all support personnel how much we appreciate their efforts to defend the country? We're going to set a record for questions asked and answered in 6 minutes and 54 seconds, if I can. Do you agree with me if sequestration goes back into effect next year, it would be devastating to the FBI?
Yes.
And it's due to do so unless Congress changes it?
I've been told that.
Okay. Do you agree with me that ISIL loses the caliphate, these people will go out throughout the world and become terrorist agents, and the threat of terrorism to the homeland is going to get greater over time, not smaller?
Yes. It'll diminish in that their power to put out their media to the troubled people in the country will decrease, but the hardened killers flowing out of the caliphate will be a big problem.
So from a funding point of view, terrorism is not going to get better. It's probably going to get worse.
I think that's fair to say.
Did you ever talk to Sally Yates about her concerns about General Flynn being compromised?
I did. I don't know whether I can talk about it in this forum, but yet the answer is yes.
But she had concerns about General Flynn, and she expressed those concerns to you.
Correct.
Okay. We'll talk about that later. Do you stand by your House testimony on March 20th that there was no surveillance of the Trump campaign that you're aware of?
Correct.
You would know about it if there were. Is that correct?
I think so, yes.
Okay. Carter Page, was there a FISA warrant issued regarding Carter Page's activity with the Russians?
I can't answer that here.
Did you consider Carter Page an agent of the campaign?
Same answer. Can't answer that here.
Okay. Do you stand by your testimony that there is an active investigation, counterintelligence investigation regarding Trump campaign individuals in the Russian government as to whether or not they collaborate? You said that in March. Is
to
that
see
still
if there
true?
was any coordination
Yeah.
between the Russian
Yeah.
effort
Right.
and people's...
Is that still going on?
Yes.
Okay, so nothing's changed. You stand by those two statements.
Correct.
But you won't tell me about Carter Page.
Not here, I won't.
Okay. The chairman mentioned that Fusion, are you familiar with Fusion?
I know the name.
Okay. Are they part of the Russian intelligence apparatus?
I can't say.
Okay. Do you agree with me that if Fusion was involved in preparing a dossier against Donald Trump, that would be interfering in our election by the Russians?
I don't want to say.
Okay. Do you agree with me that Anthony Weiner of 2016 should not have access to classified information?
Yes, that's a fair statement.
Would you agree with me that if that's not illegal, we've got really bad laws?
Well, if he hadn't...
Well, he got it somehow.
It would be illegal if he didn't have appropriate clearance.
Well, do you agree with me he didn't have appropriate clearance?
He did.
If he did have appropriate clearance, that'd even be worse.
I don't believe at the time we found that on his laptop that he had any kind of
Yeah,
clearance.
I agree. So for him to get it should be a crime. Somebody should be prosecuted for letting Anthony Weiner have access to classified information. Does that make general sense?
It could be a crime. It would depend upon what the people...
Well, do you agree with me it should be? That anybody that lets Anthony Weiner have classified information probably should be prosecuted.
Well,
if our laws don't cover that, they probably should.
There's no Anthony Weiner statute, but it is... There's already
Okay. Well, maybe we need one.
there's already a statute.
All right, good.
There's already a statute.
I just wonder how you can get classified information and it not be a crime by somebody. Unmasking, are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with that term.
Okay, has the Bureau ever requested unmasking of an American citizen caught up in incidental collection?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I did it this week in connection with an intelligence report.
All right, before I reauthorize 702, and I'm a pretty hawkish guy, I want to know how unmasking works. Are you aware of any requests by the White House, anybody in the Obama administration, to unmask American citizens that were caught up in incidental surveillances in 2015 or 2016?
I'm not. I'm not aware of any request to the FBI.
Would you know, who would they make the request to?
Well, they can make it to anyone in the FBI who was...
What about the NSA? Wouldn't you make it to the NSA?
Sure, if it was an NSA report.
Okay.
I've read in the media and heard about NSA reports.
When you ask for
I don't
unmasking,
know.
who do you ask? Do you go to the NSA to ask that somebody be unmasked?
When I want, for example, I'll give you an example. I got a report this week that said U.S. company number 1
Right.
had been removed, and I said, I believe I need to know the name of that company.
Who do you ask?
So I asked my intelligence briefer, who works
Okay.
for the PDB staff, say, I'd like to know that. And then she goes and asks the owner of the information.
Which would be the NSA?
Well, in this case, I think it was CIA information, saying the director
Does the owner of the information record requests for unmasking?
I believe the NSA does. CIA, I don't know about CSA. NSA definitely does.
But there should be a record somewhere in our government for a request to unmask, regardless of who made the request.
I think that's right.
Is it fair to say that very few people can make requests for unmasking? I mean, I can't go and make that request as a senator, can I?
Sure, it's a fairly small group, the consumers, which I am,
Yeah.
of that small set
Is the
of...
National Security Council within that group that can make this request, or do you know?
I don't know for sure. I think the National Security Advisor certainly can.
Okay. When it comes to Russia, is it fair to say that the government of Russia actively provides safe haven to cyber criminals?
Yes.
Is it fair to say that the Russian government is still involved in American politics?
Yes.
Is it fair to say we need to stop them from doing this?
Yes, fair to say.
Do you agree with me the only way they're going to stop is for them to pay a price for interfering in our political process?
I think that's a fair statement.
Yeah, okay. So what we're doing today is not working. They're still doing it. They're doing it all over the world, aren't they?
Yes.
So what kind of threat do you believe Russia presents to our democratic process, given what you know about Russia's behavior of late?
Well, certainly, in my view, the greatest threat of any nation on earth, given their intention and their capability.
Do you agree that they did not change the actual vote tally, but one day they might?
I agree that very much. We found no indication of any change in vote tallies. There was efforts aimed at voter registration systems, but I suppose in theory, hard in the United States, the beauty of our system is it's a bit of a hairball, and all different kinds of systems and you know, elderly...
Have they done this in other countries where they actually tampered with the vote?
My understanding is they have attempted it in other countries.
And there's no reason they won't attempt it here if we don't stop them over time.
I think that's fair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome back, Director Comey. What is the policy of the Department and the Bureau regarding the release of derogatory investigative information about an uncharged subject?
The general practice is we don't talk about completed investigations that didn't result in charges, as a general matter.
And what is the policy regarding release of derogatory information about charged subjects beyond the derogatory investigative information disclosed either in the charging document or in further court proceedings?
Well, I think you summarized it. The gist of the policy is you don't want to do anything outside the charging documents or the public record that might prejudice the trial proceeding.
And one of the reasons you do that is if you had a police chief say, we have investigated the contract between the mayor and the contractor, and we've decided there were no misdeeds, but we found out that the mayor was sleeping with her driver. Just wanted to let you know that. That would be kind of a blow to the integrity of the prosecutor function and would probably tend to diminish support for the prosecutor function if it were played by those rules, correct?
I think that's fair. That's why the policy exists.
Yep. With respect to oversight questions, let's hypothesize that an investigation exists and the public knows about it, which could happen for a great number of legitimate reasons. What questions are appropriate for senators to ask about that investigation in their oversight capacity?
They can ask anything they want.
What questions are appropriate for you to answer?
Very few, while a matter is pending. And
while we know it's pending, is it appropriate for you to tell us whether it's adequately resourced and to ask questions about, for instance, are there actually agents assigned to this, or has this been put in somebody's bottom drawer?
Sure, potentially, right. How's it being supervised? Who's working on it? That sort of thing.
And are there benchmarks in certain types of cases where departmental approvals are required or the involvement of certain department officials is required to see whether those steps have actually been taken?
I'm not sure I'm following the question. I'm sorry.
Well, let's say you've got hypothetically a RICO investigation and it has to go through procedures within the department necessary to allow a RICO investigation to proceed. If none of those have ever been invoked or implicated, that would send a signal that maybe not much effort has been dedicated to it. Would that be a legitimate question to ask? Have these, again, you'd have to know that it was a RICO investigation, but assuming that we knew that that was the case, would those staging elements as an investigation moves forward in the internal department approvals be appropriate for us to ask about and you to answer about?
Yeah, that's a harder question. I'm not sure it would be appropriate to answer it because it would give away what we were looking at potentially.
Would it be appropriate to ask if whether any witnesses have been interviewed or whether any documents have been obtained pursuant to the investigation?
That's also a harder one. I'd be reluctant to answer questions like that because it's a slippery slope to giving away information about exactly what you're doing.
But if we're concerned that investigation gets put on the shelf and not taken seriously, the fact that no witnesses have been called and no documents have been sought would be pretty relevant and wouldn't reveal anything other than a lack of attention by the Bureau, correct?
It could, but we're very careful about revealing how we might use a grand jury, for example. And so if we start answering...
Well, you've got 6E, I understand that.
Yeah.
This is a separate thing.
Yeah, so that's a harder call.
Well, we'll pursue it.
Okay.
What is the department's or the Bureau's policy regarding witnesses who are cooperating in investigation, who have some form of ongoing compliance problem? Let's say they haven't paid their taxes for the last year. Is it the policy of the department or the Bureau that they should get those cooperating witnesses to clean up their act so that their noncompliance does not become an issue later on in the case?
Yes, I don't know whether it's a written, I know I should know this, I can't remember sitting here whether it's a written policy. It's certainly a long-standing practice.
Long-standing practice, exactly. When are tax returns useful in investigating a criminal offense?
Well, they're useful in showing unreported income, motive. If someone hides something that should otherwise be on a tax return, it indicates they might know it was criminal activity.
It's not uncommon to seek and use tax returns in a criminal investigation.
Not uncommon. It's a very difficult process, as it should be, but especially in complex financial cases, it's a relatively common tool.
The hearing that Senator Graham and I held with respect to Russia's infiltration and influence in the last election raised the issue of Russia intervening with business leaders in a country, engaging them in bribery or other highly favorable business deals with a view to either recruiting them as somebody who has been bribed or being able to threaten them by disclosing the illicit relationship. They're perfectly happy to blow up their own cutout, but it also blows up the individual. Have you seen any indication that those are Russian strategies in their election influence toolbox?
In general, my
understanding
is those are tools that the Russians have used over many decades.
And lastly, the European Union is moving towards requiring transparency in corporations so that shell corporations are harder to create. That risks leaving the United States as the last big haven for shell corporations. Is it true that shell corporations are often used as a device for criminal money laundering?
Yes.
Is it true that shell corporations are also often used as a device for the concealment of criminally garnered funds?
Yes.
And to avoid legitimate taxation?
Yes.
What do you think the hazards are for the United States with respect to election interference of continuing to maintain a system in which shell corporations that you never know who's really behind them are commonplace?
I suppose one risk is that it makes it easier for illicit money to make its way into a political environment.
And that's not a good thing.
I don't think it is.
Yeah, me neither. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. Director, thank you for being here. Given the FBI's extensive responsibilities and expertise in cyber and counterintelligence investigations, how likely do you think it is that Senate IT systems have been targeted by foreign intelligence services?
I would estimate it's a certainty.
And inside the IC, who would talk about that problem, and who at the Senate would they inform?
Well, there have been I don't want to talk about particular matters, but it often is the FBI alerting a U.S. government institution or private sector. DHS might come across it, or other parts of the intelligence community, especially NSA.
When we talk about things like cyber investigations right now, so often on cable TV, it becomes a shirts and skins exercise. So without asking you to comment about anything that's retrospective about 2016, do you think it's likely that in 2018 and beyond, you're going to see more targeting of U.S. Public discourse and elections?
I do. I think one of the lessons that particularly the Russians may have drawn from this is that this works. And so, as I said a month or so ago, I expect to see them back in 2018, especially in 2020.
You regularly testify, and correct me if I've misheard you, but I think you've regularly testified that you don't think the Bureau is short of resources. You don't come before us and make big increased appropriations requests. And yet, those of us who are very concerned about cyber look at the U.S. government writ large and think we're not at all prepared for the future. Can you tell us what the FBI is doing to prepare for that 2018 and 2020 circumstance that you envision?
Without giving too much detail, we have an enormous part of the FBI in our counterintelligence division and in our cyber division that focuses on just that threat and making sure that we do everything we can to understand how the bad guys might come at us, and as I talked about earlier, to equip the civilian agencies that are responsible for hardening our infrastructure with all the information we have about how they're going to come at us.
And if you had, in your national security domain, increased resources, how would you spend another marginal dollar beyond what you expect to receive now?
I'd probably have a tie between investing more in upgrading our systems to make sure we're keeping pace with the bar of excellence, and probably to hire additional cyber agents and analysts.
And if you had your druthers, what kind of increased funding request would you make?
I wouldn't make any sitting here.
I'd like to talk a little bit about WikiLeaks. In January, the FBI contributed to an IC assessment that concluded that WikiLeaks is a known outlet of foreign propaganda. Do you stand by that assessment?
Yes.
Do you believe that WikiLeaks has released sensitive and classified information?
Yes.
Do you believe any of WikiLeaks' disclosures have endangered American lives and or put at risk American interests?
I believe both have been the result of some of their releases.
Can you help me understand why Julian Assange has not been charged with a crime?
Well, I don't want to comment on the particular case because I don't want to confirm whether or not there are charges pending. He hasn't been apprehended because he's inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London.
I sent a letter to the Attorney General a number of weeks ago asking questions about the status of the investigation, and it seemed pretty clear, though individuals were polite and kind and responsive to our request, it seemed that across the IC there wasn't much deliberation about WikiLeaks and about Julian Assange. And this question, is the FBI participating in any interagency dialogue about whether or not Assange has committed crimes?
I don't know where you got that impression, but WikiLeaks is an important focus of our attention.
I intentionally left almost half of my time for you to sort of wax broadly for a minute. There is room for reasonable people to disagree about at what point an allegedly journalistic organization crosses a line to become some sort of a tool of foreign intelligence. There are Americans, well-meaning, thoughtful people who think that WikiLeaks might just be a journalistic outfit. Can you explain why that is not your view?
Yeah, and again, I want to be careful that I don't prejudice any future proceeding. It's an important question because all of us care deeply about the First Amendment and the ability of a free press to get information about our work and publish it. To my mind, it crosses a line when it moves from being about trying to educate a public and instead just becomes about intelligence porn, frankly, just pushing out information about sources and methods without regard to interest, without regard to the First Amendment values that normally underlie press reporting, and simply becomes a conduit for the Russian intelligence services or some other adversary of the United States just to push out information to damage the United States. And I realize reasonable people, as you said, struggle to draw a line, but surely there's conduct that's so far to the side of that line that we can all agree there's nothing that even smells journalist about some of this conduct.
So if you could map that continuum, there are clearly members of the IC that have at different points in the past leaked classified information. That is an illegal act, correct?
Correct.
When American journalists court and solicit that information, have they violated any law by asking people in the IC to potentially leak information that is potentially classified?
That conduct is not treated by the U.S. government as criminal conduct. Now, I've been asked in other contexts, isn't it true that the espionage statute has no carve-out for journalists? That's true, but at least in my lifetime, the Department of Justice's view has been news gathering and legitimate news reporting, is not covered, is not going to be investigated or prosecuted as a criminal act. That's how it's thought of.
So an investigative reporter taking advantage of and celebrating the liberties that we have under the First Amendment at the Washington Post or at the Omaha World Herald or at the Lincoln Journal-Star or at the New York Times, trying to talk to people in the IC and get the maximum amount of information that they possibly can out of them to inform the public. It is not the burden of an American journalist to discern whether or not the member of the IC is leaking information that might be classified. The journalist can legitimately seek information, and it's not their job to police it. The member of the US IC that leaks classified information has broken a law.
Right. The clear legal obligation rests on those people who are in the government in possession of intelligence, classified information. It's not the journalist's burden.
Okay.
Our focus is and should be on the leakers, not those that are obtaining it as part of legitimate news gathering.
So I want to hear this part one more time, and I know that the chairman has indulged me. I'm at and past time, but the American journalist who's seeking this information differs from Assange and WikiLeaks how?
In that there's at least a portion, and people can argue that maybe this conduct WikiLeaks has engaged in the past that's closer to regular news gathering, but in my view, a huge portion of WikiLeaks' activities has nothing to do with legitimate news gathering, informing the public, commenting on important public controversies, but is simply about releasing classified information to damage the United States of America. And people sometimes get cynical about journalists. American journalists do not do that. They will almost always call us before they publish classified information and say, is there anything about this that's going to put lives in danger, that's going to jeopardize government people, military people, or innocent civilians anywhere in the world, and then work with us to try and accomplish their important First Amendment goals while safeguarding those interests. This activity I'm talking about, WikiLeaks, involves no such considerations whatsoever. It's what I said to intelligence porn. Just push it out in order to damage.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Franken.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. Good to see you, Mr. Director. I'm going to kind of pick up where I think Sheldon Senator Whitehouse was going. Are you familiar with a report called the Kremlin Playbook?
No.
Okay. This is an expert report that exhaustively documents Russia's past efforts to undermine European democracies. According to the report, Russia is known to cultivate close ties with business and political